living letters. We are to evaluate our ministry effectiveness by the Christlike changes that take place in people's lives. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
As Paul began chapter 3, look at his words. Look what he said. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some letters of recommendation to you or from you, you yourselves are our letter written on our hearts, known and read by everyone? Why would Paul say that? Well, if you understand that he just received a report from Titus, you can fill in the blank. Titus said, Paul, they love you. But there's also some bad news. The bad news is there are false apostles in Corinth that are telling the Corinthians that you're not a true apostle. And so Paul, as he pens this letter, addresses this issue. And he says, in essence, we don't need written letters. You are our letter, that we are authentic. I am an authentic apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, we've already seen several other issues. For example, a request for prayer. You remember after he dealt with comfort, he wrote about prayer. Paul asked the Corinthians for continual prayer for protection, particularly in Macedonia. Remember that? Right at the beginning. Why did he write that? Because he was in Macedonia. And there he had conflict within and conflict without. So now we understand why he made reference to his continual need for prayer. 2 Corinthians, he said, in fact, when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest. Instead, we were troubled in every way, conflicts on the outside, fears within. And so that tells us that he was in Macedonia when he wrote the letter. It was in Macedonia that he had no rest. This was past tense, as he now picks up the letter, or picks it up, the scroll, and begins to write. Furthermore, Titus said, there's another issue, Paul. They don't understand why you didn't come back. And the false apostles are accusing you of being double-minded and fickle and fearful of even coming back. And so, what does Paul do in the letter? He gives an explanation. And here you have it. Paul explained why he had not returned, but wrote a letter instead. And here it is, 2 Corinthians 1. He's answering the question that Titus brought him in Macedonia. I call on God as a witness on my life that it was to spare you that I did not come to Corinth. That's why I didn't come. In fact, I made up my mind about this. I would not come to you on another painful visit. That's why I wrote the letter. And why I went on to Troas rather than coming back. No, I don't say yes, yes, and no, no. There was a reason, and here it is. And so, in the letter, he explains why he didn't come back. And then Titus said, and Paul, there's another issue. In that painful letter, you told them how to deal with sin and the individual that was creating all these problems. Well, I just want you to know they took your word. But there's an issue because that person who's been punished and separated is emotionally in disarray. And so Paul immediately in the letter dealt with that issue. Paul wanted the Corinthians to forgive and restore the person who had created all the problems in Corinth. And that's why he wrote in chapter 2, this punishment by the majority is sufficient for that person. As a result, you should instead forgive and comfort him. So Paul addressed that issue. But then Titus said, now, Paul, Here's the big problem. There are some false apostles in Corinth. And those individuals are saying that you are not a true apostle. You're a false apostle. And one of the reasons they're giving is that you have no credentials. You have no written letter that states that you're a true apostle. And so Paul addresses that issue with these words right at the beginning of chapter 3. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. He is saying, Corinthians, I have no letter of recommendation. You are my letter because of what has happened in your life as a result of my ministry as a true apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, Paul really understood where these guys were coming from because he was one at one time in his life. Remember Acts 9? Now Saul, that was his name before conversion, was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and requested what? Letters. Now that's a clue as to the fact that these false apostles in Corinth were Jews, just like he was. But Jews who hated the gospel of Jesus just like he hated the gospel of Jesus. And so, in retrospect, he would remember when he went to the high priest, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, these 70 men, and asked for letters. Letters from him to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any men or women who belonged to the way, he might bring them as prisoners to Jerusalem. He would come with his letter from the Sanhedrin, from the high priest. And that was his authority. And here these false apostles are doing the same thing that he did when he was an unsaved Jew. And his response to this was, I don't need a written letter. You are my letter. And that's why he wrote here in 2 Corinthians 3:3, you show that you are Christ's letter, delivered by us, not written with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And by the way, when he says, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts, that's another cue and clue as the fact that these false apostles were Jews, because only Jews would have understood the word tablets of stone. And earlier in the book of Romans, he said, not all Jews are true Jews, but only those who are circumcised in their hearts. So here he talks about not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. The change that came into the lives of these individuals. Here's a reflection and response question. Though verbal self-defense is sometimes necessary and appropriate, why is it so important to allow the Christ-like changes in people's lives to verify our own godly character? And let me just simply say this. People can very quickly forget what we say. But people will not forget what we are. That's ongoing. That's a living letter. And so Paul is saying, you're the verification. You're the letter that demonstrates that I preach the true gospel of Jesus Christ as an apostle who was called by Jesus Christ to take the gospel to the Gentile world.